Thank you. Now it'll work. All right, we're here with Stephen Robinson, as I was saying, and he has definitely done a lot of amazing work, and I'm glad to have him here on the radio show with Mark Lee on Pod TV, and we're going to talk about his encounter with the current president, Donald Trump, who was the president in the past and who had some dealings with when there was a big building that was trying to be built in the whole area of New York City, and all along those lines. And a lot of folks have been talking about how the current president is transactional, and definitely we might even be seeing that in some of his current picks and everything as he is putting together his cabinet and all along those lines. And we've got Elon Musk, who is very much involved in Twitter and Tesla and a number of other endeavors and a number of other folks that are in the corporate space and in those kind of spaces and all along those lines. But before Donald Trump became friends with Elon Musk, he had to encounter Mr. Robinson. And Mr. Robinson was definitely taking him on there in New York and was definitely having an amazing meeting with him and all along those lines. So I'd love to hear from Mr. Robinson, his thoughts around the current president. I know when we tried to do this before, it was before the elections, and I think we were both hoping for the outcome that did not happen. But a lot of folks are thinking that we're in for a rough 2 years, and I'm thinking Mr. Robinson might be thinking the same thing and all along those lines. But if you want to share a little bit about your thoughts and what's going on in your life and all along those lines, and your book and what you had happening with the former president who is now about to be president elect.
Well, the book called Turf War takes place mostly in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when Trump was trying to develop as a real estate mogul, was trying to develop a property on the west side of Manhattan along the Hudson River. And his proposal was so overwhelming that a bunch of us got together at the time and decided that we had to somehow stop this from being approved by the city of New York. And so the book is really the story of community organizing and working with natural allies and working with existing and well-established nonprofit organizations in New York City and around the country to stop this proposal from being approved by the city. And we did, after 5 years of engagement, we did actually end up stopping the project. And simultaneously, we had designed an alternative scheme for the site. And once his project was stalled, he came to our civic groups and basically capitulated and adopted our concept, which was much more suited to the community, environmentally sound, and a developer could make money at it. And that's and then we got that plan approved by the city of New York, and quite soon after that, Trump sold the property. So he actually had never had anything to do with the actual development.
So that's a lot of stuff going on. I know one of the things that we talked about last time that I had a chance to talk with you was the notion of being activists. And I think you said you kind of fell into activism when maybe not even considered yourself an activist when you were a young architect and growing into the field and all along those lines. But how important do you think it is for people that are in different cities to stay engaged with their community and to even find ways that they can get their voices heard? I think that I told you before that there was even efforts here in Durham, North Carolina, where there is malls and they're trying to, or former malls, and they're trying to figure out what to do with those mall spaces and all along those lines. So definitely, I was just wondering your thoughts around the need for being involved in what's going on in your building in general, just in as a city, not just city planner, but a citizen of whatever city you're in, whether it's a big city like New York or a small city like Durham, or maybe even a small town like rural North Carolina.
Well, the problem is that real estate development, um, often small projects as well as large projects, are discussed and evaluated between the developer and the municipality, whether it's a town or a city or a county. And those discussions are normally not available to the public. And of course, it's the residents of whatever community we're talking about who are going to be most deeply affected by any new development. So I think the first thing is that as a concerned citizen about the character of your community, of your neighborhood, of your city, to be aware of what development proposals are being made to the city, and figure out how to intervene if you find them potentially threatening to the quality of life in your community. Intervention is the key. And in different municipalities and cities and towns, the mechanisms for intervention will be different. But normally, these deals are made behind closed doors, and by the time residents get an opportunity to speak, the deals are done. So you have to find out early. If you're concerned, you have to make your voice felt early, and get engaged in the process.
How important do you think? Because I know one of the things I think you're big on is making sure that the cities and the plans that are built are suitable and that they're very much engaged in everything. I know there's been a lot of talk here in Durham about making sure that you have greenways, that you have certain kind of environmental concerns that are met, that you have walkable communities, even some of our communities that are built around large mall kind of complexes. They'll oftentimes want to make sure that amenities are nearby for the residents to enjoy, whether that's a movie theater, whether that's a walk-in park, or whether that's a number of other things. So even in the design that y'all had around New York, it looked like y'all were trying to make sure that there was a lot of things that would be amenable to people. Whereas from what I remember, Donald Trump had like some ridiculous amount of thousands of cars that he was going to do with his parking deck and everything like that. But how important do you think it is to have these kind of amenities in place in the city planning?
Well, it brings up the question of city planning, and some communities have more responsive planning commissions than others. Some are, deeply, truly concerned about the quality of life of the residents, and some are more concerned with accommodating the developer. So the city planning is not a monolith. It's a very much a variable institution in cities and towns across the country. But what Trump was proposing was 18.5 million square feet of development on the west side of Manhattan, on a half a mile of the Hudson River waterfront. It included 7 major luxury towers and a headquarters for NBC, National Broadcasting Company, and the world's tallest building, all of which was sitting on a platform about 70 feet above grade, above the level of the rail yard. And underneath that platform, there was a 2 million square foot shopping mall, the largest, would have been the largest east of the Mississippi at the time, and a 9,000 car parking garage. So it was pretty obvious to a lot of residents that the environmental impacts of that development, um, the pollution of the automobiles, the traffic congestion, the damage to local retail. The Upper West Side is famous for having locally owned, local serving retail. Would have been decimated by a regional shopping mall. Um, the project had basically a 60-foot high wall facing the neighborhood. So it was intended to be an exclusive luxury development. And at that time, we're talking in the 1980s, it was almost 40 years ago. The Upper West Side was a very vibrant, mixed community, and mixed racially, mixed in terms of income levels, mixed in terms of the kind of amenities that were made it an attractive place to live. Um, and the only public amenity, you asked about amenities, the only public amenity in Trump's plan was a very narrow promenade along the riverfront. But in essence, that project privatized the riverfront. And our alternative idea was to create a 21-acre park along the river, which would be a continuation of the Riverside Park to the north and a link to the 9W Esplanade to the south, and creating a hike and bikeway all around the west side of Manhattan. And we had no regional shopping mall. Instead of that, we had street level retail in a far fewer number of buildings to animate the pedestrian experience. And we had no 9,000 car parking garage. We were proposing that each building, as is fairly typical in Manhattan, have parking built underground below the building to service its own residents and visitors. So that was the comparison between something very overwhelming and something actually quite reasonable for the west side of Manhattan.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. At what point, Stephen, did you decide, Mr. Robinson, did you decide you wanted to get into this architectural field? Was it something that you were born into, that your family was architects? I think I told you before that one of my family friends is a hip hop artist, and his mother is a jazz artist, but his dad was a prominent architect. He actually designed some of the buildings around here, like the ballpark and a number of other things. And he was a lead architect for the African American Museum that is tied to the Smithsonian and all along those lines. So Phil Freelon was definitely a known architect here in the area. Unfortunately, passed away of Lou Gehrig's disease and all along those lines. But I just wondering what got you into the architectural field?
Well, I was lucky. When I was in college, I was studying art history. And I thought for quite a while that I would be very happy being an art historian, and teaching or working in the community of art history. And I was rubbing shoulders with architecture students, and they asked me if I would help on some drawings or building some models, and then I realized that in architecture I could actually play a role in creating the built environment, and play a role in the art history that I was so fascinated by. And I loved it. I mean, I loved it from the first course I took, and feel very fortunate that as a student, college student, I was able to recognize that architecture was my calling.
That makes a lot of sense. Everything. This group, and I think the book there was a name for the folks that got together and took out Trump and everything. So, what was the name of that group? It sounds like it was a mixture of community activists as well as some of you that had not been in the activist space in the past. Like I said, my own family came from that activist space. My dad had been involved in some civil rights stuff and the creation of the Malcolm X School here in Durham. And my parents, when I was young, as a preteen, had created a radio station because they were frustrated that they didn't hear certain voices being put out there and certain kinds of music that they loved, like jazz and blues, played enough. So they have always been, in my mind, in that activist space, and they are in their early to mid 80s now because dad's 84 and mom is 82. So I just wondered if you could tell me about the book, the title of the book, and the name of that organization that y'all put together.
Yeah, the title of the book is Turf War, and the subtitle is How a Band of Activists Saved New York from Donald Trump's Masterpiece. That's the title and subtitle. What happened was soon after he released this vision that he had for this waterfront property on the west side of Manhattan, a number of us were outraged, and among the people who were angry about this, because there was a real possibility that the city could approve it, were neighbors of mine who had had experience as activists, anti-Vietnam War activists, women's liberation movement activists, civil rights movements activists, both on a city level and on a national level. So, these were people who knew how to fight a good fight against a lot of odds. And they were acquaintances of mine, and they asked me, because I was a local architect who had expressed my outrage at this proposal, to join them. And I was the novice, and they became my mentors. And they taught me about community organizing, they taught me about fundraising, they taught me about the way in which the real estate development process, approval process works in New York City. And the name of our initial group to oppose the project was called West Pride. And we realized we had to, we were opposing a prominent developer in the big city, and that we had to have really substantial oppositions, not just throw rocks from the outside, because that rarely works. So we would need to hire environmental lawyers and environmental engineers, and to evaluate what was being proposed to the city, and make those what seemed obvious critiques available to city government and to the population of the west side of Manhattan, and then to the entire city. So we raised money, we hired those folks, and for 5 years, we thought that we would be able to at least radically modify, if not get the city to reject this proposal based on both environmental and societal issues. And then we were joined by the established nonprofits in New York who had spent 50, 70 years fighting for landmark preservation, fighting for parks and open space, fighting for regional planning that made sense. And, one of the most prominent among them was the Natural Resources Defense Council, was invaluable. And so that's how we became a consortium of civic groups. And we became, as the press started picking up on this, and newspaper and television and radio started getting interested in this conflict, what I call a turf war, um, um, we started gaining more traction.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know one of the other things that you're interested in, Mr. Robinson, and everything is this notion of historic preservation. I think I know that one of the centers that I work for, sometimes I even tape from there, and everything is the Hayti Heritage Center, which is also known as the St. Joseph's Historic Foundation, and it is actually going to get a preservation plaque. I think sometimes either later on this year or early part of next year and everything. So, how important do you think it is for us to preserve our historic monuments? Because I know Hayti was originally a AME church, an African American Methodist, African Methodist Episcopalian church that was first built in 1869 as a brush arbor, meaning folks were having service outside, literally out in the wooded area or brush area and everything. And then the physical building got built in 1891, and next year will be the 50th anniversary of it as a cultural arts center because it was a victim of gentrification, and the church has moved miles down from where it is now. But I was just wondering if you could speak to the importance of preservation from your mindset, because I know that you're very much involved in historic preservation.
Yeah, historic preservation of not only buildings but landscapes. Whether they are open public open spaces or large parks. Preservation of buildings through adaptive reuse or through support of their historic use. Uh, that's what forms the bones of a community, in my mind. It's what we are all engaged with every day of our waking lives, the buildings and the streets and the public spaces that we are engaged with. And it creates a sense of identity. Um, and so I think that historic preservation is very important
Yeah,
uh, in terms of maintaining the character of a community. And, there are lots of stories, particularly in New York, of developers wanting to tear down, historic buildings. Carnegie Hall being an amazing example.
wow.
Um, yeah, and
I didn't realize there
so
were people
I
that wanted to
think,
tear down Carnegie Hall.
pardon?
I didn't realize there were people that wanted to tear down that
Yes,
historical monument of Carnegie Hall.
yes. There was, and there was a battle over it, and the advocates for Carnegie Hall thankfully won. Um, but those are the touchstones. Those are the places, and sometimes not so famous places. As you mentioned, a small church here, or a chapel, or a school, or a library. These kinds of social institutions that really help define the character of community.
Yeah. You mentioned reuse and everything, and I think the last time we talked, I mentioned to you that actually some of our basketball players, they were actually some of the Duke basketball players, got together and created what is now known as West Village, but it was in a old tobacco plant, so it is now apartment complexes and all along those lines. And we also have American Tobacco, which is near our newer ballpark. I can't call it new anymore because it's been around for multiple decades and everything, but it's our newer ballpark. But it was also in a tobacco district because this area had things like Liggett Myers and R.J. Reynolds and American Tobacco and stuff like that. So a lot of these have been converted into office spaces and into apartments. And I think y'all have done a number of spaces like that in New York and New York City as well. So I just wanted your take on uh, these kind of reuse developments.
Yes, well, 35 years ago, I mean, as this project was getting resolved in New York, I moved to the small city of Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I have happily lived ever since. And I got involved in a oddly similar project where a developer wanted to take an abandoned rail yard that was quite close to downtown and demolish all the old buildings, and that had served the railway for 100 years, and build an upscale shopping mall, upscale residential, and a hotel and parking structures. And as I got here and began to hear about this, I really thought to myself, well, I don't know Santa Fe that well, and it may be that the people of this town want that to happen. But the one thing that I do believe is that it had to be a public conversation, not just a deal between the developer and the city government. So we started a public conversation, and the residents resoundingly came out against this. And we ended up with the city buying the property and having a community based master plan, and all of the old historic buildings were set for retention and adaptive reuse. And that was some 30 years ago, and it has become, a very successful revitalization of a little district in the city of Santa Fe.
Wow, amazing and everything. I used the term earlier, and I'd love to hear your thoughts around this and everything. This notion of the current president, well, the president elect now being the president and putting together his cabinet. And I think the last time we talked, you had kind of used the term, and I've heard other people use it, that he is very transactional and is always out to get his what is good for him and his family, and not necessarily good for the citizens. So I just wondering what your take of the election was and everything, and what you are uh, expecting, and how you will deal with this over the next 2 years or 4 years, since it does look like he's got firm control over a number of things for a while. But I was just wondering your take on what has happened in this particular election cycle.
Well, as a prelude, I want to say that as I was writing the book, it became very important to emphasize the fact that all of those of us who opposed his project, which he called Television City, never had any action or intention to oppose him personally. He happened to be the developer. He happened to have a reputation in New York. We were not going after that. We were going after what was proposed to be built in our community. And for 5 years, we had no contact with him whatsoever. We were working with the city government and trying to influence them with real good information about that proposal. So it wasn't until we we beat the project, stopped the project, and he came to us, the civic groups, that we had any contact. And during the next year, I learned that he was someone I really didn't want to have anything to do with. He is, very transactional, of course. He is, in my opinion, shows tendencies of being sociopathic. That he is largely motivated by his own self-interests, and has very little regard for either the people or the community around him. So the fact that he is now the president-elect is distressing to me, not because of him, because I really don't care about him, but it's because of the impact that his actions are likely to have on our country and on the world.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think the last time we talked, I brought this up to your attention. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this again and everything. This notion of how do you think we as a group are doing in terms of making sure that things are uh, protected in terms of being solidly built and everything? Because I know I've done work in architecture and city planning, and I think I told you that many years ago I had run across some folks that were developing a building in a area that could be called one of our gentrified communities, and one of the gentleman even told me that a good wind could possibly blow down the building because he didn't feel that they were using the best of wood and the best of material and all along those lines. He was actually the person that was constructing that particular apartment complex. Fortunately, it has stood the test of time so far, but I just remember as one that gets around by mass transit and seeing him at that bus stop being a little bit concerned when this construction worker told me that he was concerned about the nature of this particular building. And like I said, it was built several years ago, and so far we've had several major storms and it has stood the test of time, but it still resonates with me that he told me that years ago. So I just wondering how concerned are you about the way that buildings are being built at this particular time?
In general,
In general, yes, in general.
I think it varies from the kinds of uh, shoddy construction that your friend was describing to quite excellent. I don't know that I could characterize, all of the construction that's going on in the United States with a certain designation of quality.
Right. It makes sense. It's probably a mixture of different types and all along those lines and everything. I know one of the other things that I mentioned to you in our past conversation, there is a group here and they've been doing a lot of work around watersheds because there is a group here called the Ellaby Creek Association and they do a lot of building to make sure that certain watersheds and certain ponds and other things are protected and maintained, make sure that certain animal life is protected, whether that's turtles or rabbits or other things that might be out there. And in reading some of your background, I saw that you've worked both in where you are now, New Mexico, as well as in New York, in making sure that some of these watershed properties are protected as well. So I just wanted your take on how we're doing in terms of protecting some of these watershed and environmental areas and your own efforts in that kind of field. Because, like I said, I just know about Ellaby Creek here, and I also have done work with the River Association, and they do a lot of work to protect a state park here in this area, and even raise money constantly, and are always expanding that area because it is a state park as opposed to a federal park.
Well, in those years in the 1970s in New York, the Hudson River had become uh, terribly polluted by mostly by upstream industrial uses, upriver industrial uses, and it was putrid. It was foul. It was. I mean, fishing was not allowed in the Hudson River. Um, but in the late 1970s and early 1980s, environmentalists, along with some government agencies, decided uh, to clean up the river. And it took years, and it took a tremendous amount of time and money and dedication. But they really cleaned up the Hudson River, along the Manhattan waterfront, and that's what made. And they built little bikeways and hiking trails and little miniature parks, and that's what made real estate developers interested in this particular property, which was an abandoned rail yard right on on a half a mile of Hudson River waterfront. Um, so part of our efforts as community activists was to see that all that effort um, by the environmentalists and government agencies didn't get privatized by the proposal that Trump was making. That in fact, it be publicly accessible Hudson River waterfront. And that's in fact what happened. So, but it took intervention, which is I'm coming back to again. Um, and it's a curious thing because in more rural areas, a developer might see an open green space and say, "Oh, this is a great spot to do a shopping center or to do housing, multifamily or single family, to develop it in some way." And the developer may or may not be aware that that particular green space might, in fact, be, as you say, a watershed. It might be a very important source of the for the natural environment. For the animals you mentioned, for it might be part of a flyover, a flyway for migrating birds. So, and one developer might look at it and say, "Oh, I'm not going to try to buy that because it's just too important environmentally." And another developer might say, "Oh, I'm going to buy it and try to push my way through." So, but those, again, it's a question of the residents being aware of how precious their open space is, both for human recreation and for environmental reasons.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of the conversations that a lot of people have been talking about for decades now, and I know that it was part of what you were talking about, and you even kind of alluded to it with Carnegie Hall, and I'm definitely thinking that fortunately Apollo is still around and it's been around for a number of years, but there's even been talk in that area where the Apollo is of gentrification. So I just wondering your thoughts around gentrification, because it does seem like it is a problem. I know even here in Durham, North Carolina, we have a lot of developments that are high end that might be cheap to those of you that are grown up in New York, but to us, whereas again, 2,000 or 1,500 or even 2,500 is a lot of money, even though to folks from New York City that might not be as much, which is why a number of people are moving down here because they find it cheaper cost than what they were paying, and if they're paying like 3 or 4 for a studio or all along those lines. But I just wanted your thoughts around the importance of trying to have some controls around gentrification, even though gentrification, I guess, can serve some positive purposes as well, even though I'd love to hear your thoughts around this and not give my own personal opinion. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think that the fact that gentrification is occurring all over the country in cities and towns in desirable communities, and thereby changing the character of those communities. Um, I think that one of the primary obligations that a city must impose or town must impose on high end development, residential development, is a substantial component of affordable housing. So that because normally gentrification pushes out um, people with fewer resources. And that, of course, as you said, changes the character of the community. And in fact, in many ways, makes it less desirable because then it becomes a homogenous, luxurious, community. And so I think that the affordable housing piece is something which governments can impose and would um, significantly diminish the negative impacts of gentrification.
I've heard some people say, and I don't know how you feel about this, but I've heard some people say that they feel that housing should be a human right, that everybody should be able to have affordable housing, whatever that definition of affordable housing is, much the way that we have water as a human right, even though, and to some degree, even electricity, even though electricity is paid for, and water is oftentimes paid for as well. But I just wanted your thoughts about this notion of having housing as a basic human right.
Yes, I think, of course, it's a basic human right. I mean, it's a basic human right, food, shelter, and clothing, are basic human rights. And the social and political efforts required to create those human rights for every resident are imperative. And, so I do think that the governments, it's interesting. Governments, federal, state, and local governments are malleable. And they're malleable by intent because they are intended to serve different conflicting purposes and different intentions by the diversity of our communities. And I think that when government's working well, then those governments are serving the largest possible human needs of the community. And when governments aren't working well, you see um, a terribly unequal um, community where, because as we know, very often the powers that be, the most wealthy in a community, often are the largest contributors to political campaigns. And, that's part of the nature and the difficulty. I mean, boy, if I could change one thing in the United States, it would be publicly funded election systems, and not allow in any way private funding of elections. Um, because I think that there's, that is to some extent the root of the problems that we have in our communities.
I know that one of the things we talked about before was a lot of the people that were helping you were activists, and you mentioned that before, and they were even activist lawyers. So, if you might wanted to share some of the people that were important in this effort, not just yourself, but others that were important, whether they were from the legal field or from the activism community, I'm sure that our listeners would be interested in learning about these folks, and if they are still active. I think some of them may be like you and maybe retired and all of those lines, and some of them may still be very active, because I do know that even in the ages of the 80s and the 90s, there are still some folks that are still active in their fields. Like a good friend of mine, or a good family friend, Howard Fuller, is still active in the charter school movement. And I want to say he's close to my dad's age, probably like in his early 80s, or maybe pushing maybe a little bit younger, like 70s, but I'm thinking he's early 80s and still active in the activist space.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the areas that I wanted to really emphasize in the book, was the importance of the legal issues. And I thought to myself while I was writing it, well, this may appear to be a little dry, to some readers, but damn it, it was necessary and important. And I wanted, potential readers to understand the point you're making, about um, the necessity for legal work when you are intervening, as we did. So first, let me say that there were two lawyers who were among the founders of West Pride, uh, Bruce Simon and Victor Kovner, and they were powerful. They were absolutely. I mean, these were men who had been involved in these, local and national advocacy movements before, and they really knew how to fight. And they saw things coming that others of us didn't see. Um, and then when we went to hire a environmental attorney, the one we wanted to hire, because he was very prominent in New York, refused to work with us because he felt that it would endanger his ability to get real estate developer clients in the future. But we found two terrific environmental attorneys, Peter Payton and Kevin Healy, who were young and smart and knew the way the system worked in New York and understood it, the environmental law, and also understood the city approval process. So they were invaluable in our efforts to make our case. And, by the way, we stopped Television City not because of all of its environmental damage, negative impacts, but because the city of New York had, in the middle of the game, changed its zoning regulation to reduce the standards to which Television City would be held during the review process. And our lawyers said, whoa, wait a minute. There may be a lawsuit here against the city. So what happened was that we did, and of course we filed the lawsuit and we won. We beat City Hall. And that is, we didn't win on environmental grounds, we won on legal grounds. And the so um, it's and then during that period that we were considering litigation, again, the Natural Resources Defense Council, weighed in and played a very important role. So we had both local land use attorneys and environmental attorneys, and national land use and environmental attorneys, and um, so I think that when you are concerned about something, a concerned citizen about a potential development, you must keep in mind that it may end up in court.
No doubt about that.
And good lawyers make the difference.
Oh, yeah. They definitely make the difference. I know that one of the founders of this network is a pension attorney. He's actually helping some folks on the case himself and all along those lines involving pensions and all in that space because he's taken a couple of things to the Supreme Court and all in that space. So Nick Valveda has definitely been in the legal space. One of the things I've been hearing people talk about, even under this administration we're about to have starting in January of next year, is the notion of resistance. And it sounds like a lot of what y'all were doing was resistance. So, how important do you think it is, just in general, to have resistance, and also how important do you think it is for folks to get involved, not just in their national politics, but in their local politics? So, I know that that's two separate questions, but I'd love to hear your thoughts around resistance and also around the importance of being involved in your local government.
Well, resistance is generated in people when we find something that is disturbing to us. And when it's disturbing, you first, I think, at least in our case, was we got angry. And that was an emotional reaction to being blocked out of the decision making, to having a stranger come and with political and financial resources have his way with our community. Anger. And that anger, if you can do the organizing, the community organizing, and the educating about the potential danger, then you can develop a resistance to something that is being widely considered as problematic. And then that resistance, in my mind, can be parlayed into action in which the community can intervene in changing the way something might go down in your community.
That makes sense. Like I said, you kind of touched on it, but how important do you think it is to be involved not just in national politics, but in local politics? So, like I said, y'all were definitely doing something there in New York City. I know a lot of people that will pay attention to their soil and environmental folks in their offices, or even their, in some cases, dog catcher, and definitely their city councils. And here we have county commissioners as well, meaning here in Durham, North Carolina. But I just wonder, how important do you think it is to get involved in your local politics and even some of these different agencies, understanding what they do and who you would reach out to if you had certain problems?
Well, two things occur to me. First, is that we all, we're all living in communities, and those communities, we may think of as urban neighborhoods, we may think of them as small town villages, we may think of them as rural counties, but all of those entities have governments. And so in order to have your opinions heard, you have to engage in government. You have to go to these meetings. You have to go to city planning commission meetings. You have to go to community board meetings. You have to go to, um, whatever environmental agencies are operating in your community, whatever educational agencies are operating in your community, and really find out what's going on and express your opinions. The other level of importance of local government is that local governments play a huge role in state and national politics. So that, when a political party, gains control over um, uh, any agency of city government or any agency of regional or local government, there is a national and a federal impact there. Um, and, I've heard it said that the years ago, the Republicans recognized this and worked very hard to have Republicans be leaders at the local level of politics and governance, so that when it came time to have a national election, the grassroots would be controlled by their party.
Yep. Interesting concept and everything. Well, like last time, I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. You're ready to wrap it up, and I think we've got a lot of powerful information that folks have gathered from this conversation and everything. I think last time I asked you, and I'll ask you again, how can folks get a copy of the book? How can they learn more about you? If there's any other messages that you'd like to share that we haven't shared in this 45-minute to 50-minute conversation and everything, and also any message of positivity that you would like to share with our audience and everything like that. Like I said, I know we had some glitches in times, but as always, I enjoy these conversations and hope we can have another in-depth conversation. But this one I know I got because I saw the recording button and everything. So
Okay.
I definitely greatly appreciate it.
All right. And I appreciate your trying a second time. I really do. Um, the title of the book is Turf War. Uh, my name is Stephen Robinson. The book is available wherever books are sold. And my preference would be to, if people are at all interested in buying the book, I would like to support our local independent booksellers wherever they are. And of course, the book is available wherever books are sold. Um, and one of the reasons that I wanted to write this book was so that residents in cities and towns across the country who are feeling any kind of concern or perhaps even a threat about a potential real estate development, um, we went through this battle for years, and there are lessons to be learned from the strategies that we used in order to be successful. And so it's a bit of a primer for those who might want to learn how to get engaged in issues like local real estate development.
Well, I greatly appreciate it. Great, powerful conversation. Any message of positivity that you want to share with people in general? And then we'll pause this one. I think I got another recording I've got to do later as well. But any message of positivity that you want to share with our audience and everything?
Yeah, I think that as much as real estate development is mostly governed by the landowner and the local government, um, there are successful examples of residents participating and helping to guide the character of their community rather than just being the victims of the growth that may be inappropriate to their community. So I feel very positive about engagement in and intervention where you feel it's necessary, and you can win. You can win.
Can win, and you've definitely proven that by taking on the person that's about to be president in next year and everything. But get ready to end and put this on pause and everything. But I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and like I said, I hope that you'll make a return trip in the not too distant future, because this has been a great conversation, and I have thoroughly enjoyed it, and I think our audience has enjoyed it as well. So look forward to seeing you back in the not too distant future on another one of these powerful conversations. But I have thoroughly enjoyed our conversation on this particular time and all along those lines. So, like I said, going to put this on pause and get my other folks that'll be talking about
Okay.
gospel music on
Well,
everything.
thank you. And I really appreciate your questions and
Well,
your, thank you very much.